theoretically, there's nothing super surprising about what we've measured. This is how theoretically we understand the universe to work. But it's one of those things that you need to measure. If we can't measure it, maybe the universe doesn't work the way we think it does. So this result confirms the predictions of over a century ago that matter can be in two locations at once, and it can then interfere with itself even in those locations. So it's great to see so much interest and so many people keen to learn about the science that we're doing here. I hadn't really thought that many people would be interested in our work. We got a lot of questions from that first YouTube video, and we're going to try and answer a few of them here, and hopefully explain a few of the extra details of our experiment that we weren't able to include in our original video. So we've had quite a few questions about whether what we've done is actually something new, or whether it's been seen before, such as this one, which says, "We have observed things containing multiple atoms in superposition already. I read an article about it in June 2011. So while you're correct that previous results have shown atoms to be able to be in superposition, and indeed large numbers of atoms, up to a few thousand atoms have been able to be put in superpositions, no one's actually shown that the atoms can be entangled with each other in their motional degrees of freedom, which was our result. So it's the entanglement, which is a superposition of multiple atoms into motional quantum states, so in their momentum. One of the biggest questions that we seem to have from our initial video was what we'd exactly measured and whether it was entanglement versus superposition. This question here, for instance, that says, is this quantum entanglement? That's definitely what we measured. We measured quantum entanglement, and the difference between that and what some other people, some other commenters thought we might have measured, which is superposition. I'm just going to explain that very briefly. So in quantum terms, superposition is when you have one particle and you can make it be in at least two different states at once. Can be more, but two is the easiest to think about. So in our case with the billiard balls, if we think about an atom being a billiard ball, it could be in two different places at once, or it could have two different momentum, so it could be moving in two different directions at once. That would be in a superposition. It will be in that superposition until you measure it, and when you measure it, you'll only ever see one of those results, but until you measure it, the fact that it's in both of these states is still relevant, and it can still affect how it evolves. That's all been measured previously many times for both light and atoms and all sorts of other particles. But what our experiment showed was entanglement, which is another step above that. And that's basically a superposition of two or more particles. So in our case, it was a superposition of two atoms. And so rather than one atom being in two states at once, we now have two atoms, and each of those atoms can be in a superposition of two different states, but they're in a correlated way such that if one of the atoms is in one state, you know what the state of the other one will be, and vice versa. And so yeah, that's what we measured, which is called entanglement. How can it be said that an atom is in two places at once? This requires a measurement. The video stated that when a measurement is made, the atom is only in one place. What evidence is there that the atom is in two places at once before measurement? So this is a great question, and indeed you're correct that you can never measure an atom in two places at once. What you can measure is you can see the effects of it previously being in a superposition of two places at once. And so even though you might only measure it at one particular place, if you then take the two parts of that superposition and interfere them with each other again, then you can see via the statistics of your measurement the effects of it previously being in two places. One of the types of questions we had was typified by this one, which is, does their mass double? Who holds the mass? Nothing is lost or created. This is kind of a really important point and a great question. Mass is always conserved in a system. So if there's one atom, it always has the same mass. It's just that that atom and the mass of that atom, therefore, can be spread out to be in different places at once, or in this case, different states. Yeah, how that exactly, the implications that that has for things such as gravity, that's something we're not actually sure about, because gravity and quantum mechanics, there's still not a complete picture that describes both of those, and this is one of the sort of future directions that people are looking to investigate. So we also saw a few comments comparing this to the double slit experiment. And again, the double slit experiment, which is another classic quantum experiment that shows that a particle can go through two different slits at once, that's slightly different. Again, that's only showing that a single particle can go through two different slits at once, that's just a superposition effect rather than an entanglement effect. What ours would be the equivalent of is showing that if you had two double slits and you had two atoms going through one atom going through each of those double slits, which slit this atom went through is correlated with which slit the other atom went through. And that's what entanglement is. Wasn't this idea explored in Schrödinger's cat? So Schrödinger's cat is a popular way to refer to a quantum effect, which is the effect. It's essentially a superposition effect. It basically said it was devised originally as a thought experiment to show the ridiculousness of quantum mechanics at a large scale, whereby if you could make a cat a quantum state, it could be both alive and dead at the same time, and only when you observe it would it be either choose to be alive or dead. So that's just a superposition state. Whereas what we've measured in our experiment is entanglement, which would be the equivalent of having two cats that if one was alive, the other one was also alive, and if one was dead, the other one was also dead. I should stress that in quantum mechanics, we actually don't harm any animals in the process though. All right, so this comment, I would love to see a longer video, as long as necessary, that explained the experimental apparatus and concepts in extreme detail. Well, we've listened, and that's what we've decided to do here. We're going to try and include as many more details as possible, and so that hopefully we can answer some of these questions and people can understand it a little bit. The first step is we have to make a large amount of helium atoms cold. So we end up with about 100,000 helium atoms, and we have to make them colder than anything naturally occurring in the universe. So less than a millionth of a degree above absolute zero, which is as cold as you can get. So much colder than deep space. So this is the start of our experimental sequence here, where we have a cryogenically cooled, so that's using liquid nitrogen to make things extremely cold. And we have a ultra cold plasma in there that generates our excited state atoms that we use for the experiment. And they then begin their journey down our beamline over this part of the experiment into our experimental chamber. We then send a beam of helium atoms down the apparatus, and they undergo a whole series of cooling and collimation stages. We then trap them using laser beams, and all the cooling is performed with laser beams. We trap them with laser beams and magnetic fields, and we cool them even further. We then put them in a magnetic trap, which is essentially a bowl made out of magnetic fields, and we then undergo an evaporation process. So evaporative cooling is essentially what makes your coffee cold in the morning, and so the hot particles bounce out of the trap, and what's left is a colder set of atoms. And we just speed up that process a little bit by forcibly lowering the walls of the potential. And once we've done that, we end up with a bunch of cold helium atoms. And so that's the starting stage of our experiment.
And once you sort of form what's called a Bose-Einstein condensate, we then run this experiment where we split the condensate into different momentum modes, and each of these modes are then entangled with each other.
So with those cold atoms, we're now in a position that we can look at their quantum properties. And so the way we do that is we split it into three different clouds of helium atoms, and we collide them together. So we collide two pairs of helium atoms, essentially. We can either have these two can collide or these two can collide. And if these two collide, then we get a pair here, and if these collide, we get a pair here. So we now have an entangled state that is atoms here and atoms here, but there's only ever one pair in the system. So when we measure it, there'll either be an atom here, pair here, or a pair here. However, when we actually create the state, they're in both places at once.
And once you sort of create this entangled pair, we then perform what's called a rarity tapster interferometer, which is essentially trying to reflect these atoms onto each other and try to create this sort of indistinguishable state where once these atoms sort of recombine, we can then impart a certain setting onto these atoms. And based on what these settings are, we expect to see different results. And so that's what our sort of, to break it down, our results is showing that as we change these settings, we see this sort of correlated behavior in these sort of entangled momentum atoms.
From the outside, it doesn't actually look very spectacular until at the end of the sequence, we switch off our trap and we drop the atoms about a meter onto our detector, where the high internal energy of the atoms means they basically, the detector goes ping, and we can record an individual atom's position. Each experimental cycle takes about 30 seconds, And so we can run several thousand experimental cycles per day if we're running continuously. The data for this result, because we're relying on extremely small coincidences, like we basically, the collisions, there aren't many atoms that collide, and we have to rely on atoms colliding into the particular mode that we want them in. And so we have an extremely low collision rate. It's several weeks worth of continuous data, and that doesn't include all the months of setup time and alignment and optimization. All right, so our experiment starts with a cloud of ultra-cold metastable helium atoms. And what we do is we give them a laser kick that pushes some of them in this direction and pushes some of them in that direction. And so we've essentially split it into 3 different clouds that the cloud moving downwards moves through the original cloud, and the cloud moving upwards also moves through the original cloud. And as they move through each other, the individual atoms in those clouds will collide, and you'll get all these pairs of collisions where you might get, this is our original cloud, you might get one atom scattered in this direction, and it will have a counterpart that's scattered in that direction because the cloud that's moving through is moving up here. And they can happen in all sorts of directions as well. You could have different scattering angles. Eventually you'll end up with what's called a scattering halo, where you have a series of atoms that are pairs of atoms, where there'll be sort of one scattered here and it will have a counterpart that's scattered over here, or you could have one that's scattered here and one that's scattered over here, etc., etc. Rub those arrows out. So, and this is our unscattered cloud. And then the same thing happens with the cloud that's moving downwards. As it collides, you'll again get these pairwise collisions, and it will also end up with a scattering halo down the bottom, where you'll have these pairs of atoms where we know if there's one here, it has to have a counterpart here because an atom from this cloud has to scatter off an atom in that cloud, and they both go in opposite directions. So we have these 2 symmetric halos, and if we just focus in on 4 of those particular momentum states, so that's these 4 atoms here, so here, 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 and here. Now, we can either have 2 atoms scattered here, or we have 2 atoms scattered here. And again, we're operating in such a low density limit that we're only ever going to have one particular scattered pair of atoms in the system. And so that's our initial entangled state, where we're in a superposition of the scattered pair of atoms either being here or here. Now, to show that those atoms are entangled, what we have to do is we have to then reflect them back off what's termed a mirror pulse, which is essentially we just give it a kick with a laser beam that pushes it back the other direction. And then we do the same with the atoms over here, so they get pushed back over here. We then split those and interfere them with each other on what's called a beam splitter. So this is one arm of our interferometer. And so we end up with 2 output ports of our interferometer, where the atom coming through here can either be split into here, the atom coming through here can be split into these 2 ports. And because they're waves, they'll then interfere with each other at this beam splitter. And we'll end up with different detection probabilities depending on how we set the phase of our beam splitter. But because there's only ever one pair of atoms in the whole system, we're only going to get this interference if indeed there is an atom here and an atom here at the same time. And so that's kind of how you'd show that there is indeed a superposition of an atom being here and an atom being here. And then to show that it's entanglement, you have to do the same beam splitter setup and interferometer setup on the other side with the other half of the pair, and you have to correlate the results you get in the detection ports on this side with the detection ports on this side. And by looking at the correlations between those 4 and how it builds up with the different phases of our 2 interferometers, that tells us that the state was entangled, and that the only possible explanation that is consistent with our results is that atoms were in a superposition of being in both of these paths at once.
So once we created that entangled state, the test or the interferometer that we ran was to show that these are actually entangled. It's easy enough to say that in theory, yes, you should have created this entangled state, but to actually prove that they are entangled, we have to run these tests. So the test that we had to do was to show that as we sort of change the momentum of these atoms, and you sort of change the momentum of these atoms only on one side, you don't affect the other side. And just by sort of affecting the momentum on one side, you can show correlated behavior on the other side, even though the other side did not sort of experience the same effect. So just by imparting a certain phase or rotation to these momentum modes, you can sort of show that atoms have a correlated sort of correspondence with that change. They either flip or they either remain in the same momentum.
We got it to some settings that we thought would work, and we then just had to take data for several weeks. And as we were taking the data, we're analyzing it on the fly, and it's looking better and better, and it's looking pretty exciting. And eventually, yeah, we got data that showed that statistically, quantum mechanics does seem to behave the way we think it should. Now I'm going to go through a little bit about what our data looks like. So you can see I've drawn the other 4 detectors here. And what our data looks like to show the entanglement is essentially we look at the number of atoms we detect in each of these ports. And importantly, the correlations between detecting each of those. If we start with our initial state, if we detect an atom here, we're definitely going to have an atom here. And if we detect an atom here, we're going to have an atom here. And so the probability of what we call same halo correlation, so that's atoms being in the same halo, that's very high. But the probability of detecting an atom here and an atom here is essentially 0, because we said there's only one pair in this system at once. And so the probability of detecting different halo correlations will be 0. And so we have we plot something which is essentially just that, and it will start out at, the probability will be very high, it'll be sort of close to 1. This is for the same halo correlation, so those orange correlations. Now if we also track the different halo correlation, so the probability of finding an atom here and here, that's going to be extremely small, so that will be close to 0. And what we do then is, we then scan the phase of our detectors, which essentially changes the interference between the quantum states. What we see is that these probabilities change, and we can actually, as we sort of take more data, it'll look something like this. There'll be a point where they cross over, where they're about the same, and then we can change it, so we're now much more likely to detect correlations at different halos than at the same halo. And then we plot some sort of trend line to it, because that's easiest to sort of interpret, and it'll look something like a sinusoidal function, which is what theory predicts it should be. And so what that essentially shows is that by changing this phase here, we can see interference effects between this state. And that's only possible because the wave function of the atom is in both of these places at once. If we only had a single atom here or here, we wouldn't be able to detect it. It's only because we have this atom that's spread out over both paths that we can see this interference. And then furthermore, because we can see these characteristic correlations in the interference between this side and this side of the halo, that shows us that we have this entangled state. And this is what's called a Bell correlation curve. So yeah, it is a little bit science fiction-y that the atoms go both directions at once. And it might seem weird, but that's essentially because our brains have evolved to understand the classical world. It's really weird for us to think that this is how the universe works. You can read about it in a textbook, but it's really weird to think that a particle can be in 2 places at once. The fact that we can confirm that and that our work shows that is really quite amazing, that we can show that that's how the universe works. This weird quantum weirdness is actually reality. Atoms here on Earth almost never smash into each other. This only happens in this lab experiment in a mini collider. The video's title gives a misleading portrayal that atoms are in different places at the same time, while for the most part they are not. So in some ways this is absolutely correct, that our system is very artificial. We're much colder than anything naturally occurring, and we have all these laser beams and manipulate atoms in a different way. And so yes, the exact experiment we've done doesn't really occur naturally. However, the quantum effects that we're observing, such as entanglement and superposition, they're very much real effects, and they have real implications for a lot of systems. And we're kind of discovering more and more systems that they have applications in. Although our experiment is very artificial, atoms are all around us at the moment. I mean, this air is full of atoms, and they're moving around. They're colliding with us and with each other all the time. We just don't sort of see the effects of it easily because it's on such a small scale. If atoms can exist in 2 places at once, what prevents 3 places at once? So this is another great question, and there is in principle nothing stopping you being in a superposition or indeed an entangled state of more than just two states. In our experiment, we only used two states because it's kind of the simplest way to do it, and no one had done it for any number of states before, and so we just did it with two. But in principle, you could extend our experiment to 3 or 4 or 5 or more and more. It just gets much more complicated and requires a lot more time and effort. Now, there is at some point, there will be a limit and this will stop working. So in our case, we had 2 atoms entangled, and there's no reason why you couldn't entangle 3 or 4 or 5, but we know that at some point it stops working. We don't have entanglements on everyday scale, so we don't have the billiard balls. A real billiard ball will never be entangled with another billiard ball, so that might be 10 to the 23 atoms. It clearly doesn't work at that level. At what scale quantum mechanics breaks down and stops working, and you stop being able to get entanglement and superposition and all these other weird effects, that's very much an open question in an active field of research that a lot of people are looking into. How can you be sure that it is the same atom that is at 2 places at once and not just 2 different atoms? That's another great question. With our experiment, because the way we generate our entangled states is via collisions, so we have 2 clouds of helium atoms and we collide them into each other and they scatter off into these pairs where you'll have, if you have one atom here, we know there's another atom there. Because we are operating in a very low density limit, so very small numbers of atoms, we're at the limit where there'll only ever be one collision into a particular pair of what we call modes, which is basically just momentum states. And so if we measure one atom here, we know that it will have a partner over here. And so if it's in the entangled state of being in these momentum modes and these momentum modes, then we're only ever going to have 2 atoms in those 4 momentum modes, just because of the way we operate in. We actually spend a lot of time characterizing this in our system by measuring what's called correlation functions, which is basically just the probability of measuring one atom at one place given that you see an atom at another place. And so we went into a lot of detail on that. Doesn't measurement mean collapse of the wave function and superposition is lost? Yep, that's true. So if you have a wave function that is in a superposition or an entangled state and you make a measurement, then that will collapse the superposition or the entanglement and you'll get a particular result. And so that means that we can't actually measure the atoms being in multiple places at once. What we can do is we can measure the results of them being in different places at once. The experiment is more aptly explained in the subsection observed atoms entangled in motion, not observe atoms existing in 2 places at once, because superposition is actually, from a non-linear, non-subjective viewpoint, more like a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff. Yeah, so that's a reasonable point. We did definitely observe atoms entangled in motion, so that means that the atoms are in states where they're moving in different directions in a correlated way, but because they're moving in these different directions, so an atom is moving in along 2 different paths, then over time they become separated in space, and so they really are in different places at once. And then once we move them back to the same location and interfere with them, we can prove that they've moved into these different places at once. This next question, I still have a problem with accepting that the physical world's certainty requires an observer, is another great question. So in physics, we often talk about, and particularly in quantum, how systems will change when you observe them. And you've got to understand that when we use the term observe here, we're not quite using it exactly the same way that you might use it in general English. Observe is just a physics in a quantum mechanics sense. It just means interact with the system in some way. So you don't actually have to have your eyeball down there and literally see an atom do something. You just have to have a detector that does the equivalent, and it doesn't even have to be a detector that measures it. It could just be, I don't know, a piece of metal or something that the atom hits into, which then has an effect on other particles within the system, and that will be enough to destroy the superposition or entanglement or collapse your particle into a particular state. Cool post. The result is real, but the headline frames it misleadingly. The atoms in the experiment are in superposition of momentum paths, going both directions after collision, which the researchers themselves describe as being in 2 places at once. But that's not the discovery. Superposition in atoms has been demonstrated for decades. What's actually new is they ran a Bell test on momentum-entangled pairs of helium atoms, showing correlations between the pairs that can't be explained classically. That had only ever been done in momentum states with photons before. The reason it matters is that atoms have mass and coupled to gravity, which could eventually let us probe where quantum mechanics and general relativity meet. Yeah, that's a really good comment. That really sums up our result quite well, I think. Yeah, talking about the headline being a bit misleading. I don't know if misleading is the term I'd use, but it perhaps could have had a bit more detail to clarify a little bit. It's always hard with these things. I mean, even in our whole first 10-minute video, we didn't have enough space to explain the entire experiment properly, which is hence why we're doing this extra follow-up now. And yeah, in the headline, perhaps if we'd said that we observed the results of atoms existing in two places at once, that would have been a slightly more accurate way of describing it. Would have loved to have seen them produce the results in whatever form that took for us to glimpse here at home. Well, we're very happy to share our results, and science is, and particularly our science, is publicly funded, and so we feel that it's important that everyone is able to access the results that we achieve with what is essentially taxpayer-funded research. And so the paper that we've published in a journal called Nature Communications, which is an open access journal, and that means anyone can view the paper. And so there's a link in the description of our original video, and there'll be one in this video as well, to our paper. And anyone who wants to click on that, you can have a look, and there's no paywall or anything. You can read the full details of our experiment as much as you'd like. So that's all the questions that we've got time for. Thanks a lot to everyone who's watched the video, and it's great to see so many people really interested and engaged with what is kind of a very niche area of quantum research, and it's great to see so many people really interested in blue sky research.